Over the past few weeks, a trade war between China and the EU has started to look essentially inevitable. As Chinese exports to the EU have surged, but imports have stagnated, European governments have become increasingly anxious about the so-called second China shock, and after a meeting of EU leaders last week, apparently asked the European Commission to come up with tougher tools to fight the upcoming trade war. Unsurprisingly, this has provoked some anxiety that the EU might be biting off more than it can chew. After all, there's a pretty widespread consensus that China essentially won its brief trade war with the US last year, and, well, it's hard to see why Europe should expect to fare any better. However, when you really dig into it, it becomes clear that Europe actually has more leverage here than it first appears. So in this video, we're going to take another look at the looming EU-China trade war and explain why Europe might fare surprisingly well. Anxieties about material self-sufficiency, a turn towards protectionism, great powers asserting their spheres of influence, this all looks suspiciously similar to the build-up to the First World War. In the latest issue of our magazine, we explore the remarkable parallels between now and then, and ask whether we can avoid a third one. That's just one of the 80 pages in the magazine, because there's more to too long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. So, before we get into it, a quick caveat. In doing this video, we're not trying to take a position on whether the EU should or should not fight a trade war. We're just trying to say that if it does, it's not necessarily doomed. That's because as we see it, there are at least 4 reasons to think that the EU has more leverage over China than is generally assumed. The first is that after the trade war with the US, Chinese exporters, and thus the Chinese economy more generally, have become increasingly reliant on the European market. For context, we often talk about the US-China trade war and the trade truce that emerged from it as an issue that's somewhat been resolved. But while it's true that each side's tariff rate has come down from the triple-digit highs we saw in the immediate aftermath of Liberation Day, the US still has some pretty steep tariffs on China at the moment. According to analysis by the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the average US tariff rate on Chinese imports currently stands at about 47.5%. Again, way lower than the post-Liberation Day peak, but more than twice as high as it was under Biden, and more than 10 times higher than the average rate under Obama. This is actually one of the big reasons that the EU has suddenly become so anxious about China's so-called overcapacity. China has reacted to these outstanding US tariffs by redirecting exports away from the US towards the EU, which is basically the second biggest consumer market in the world. It's also worth saying that even before Liberation Day, China was relying more and more on European consumers to absorb its export surpluses. According to OECD data, for instance, the share of all Chinese manufacturing exports going to Europe rose from about 13% in 2012 to 17% in 2022, the latest year for which the OECD has data, and will have risen further since. The point we're trying to make is that the ongoing trade war with the US has accelerated a pre-existing trend, and actually made Chinese exporters more reliant on the EU, which has essentially become the consumer of last resort. This is especially true for high-end Chinese exports, which are probably too pricey for middle-class consumers in, say, South America or East Asia. Limiting access to the European market will thus cause more trouble for Beijing than it might have done before Liberation Day, when China would have been able to redirect some of its affected exports to wealthy consumers in the US, which gives the EU more leverage in any trade war. The second reason on our list is that the Chinese economy currently looks pretty weak, at least domestically. The latest data, for instance, suggests that retail sales fell by 0.6% year-on-year in May, the first decline since December 2022, when COVID was sweeping through the country. Similarly, fixed asset investment was down 4.1% year-on-year, the worst result since May 2020. The one silver lining in the data was exports, which were up 19.4%. But while this might sound great, this combination of falling retail sales, which basically measure domestic demand, and rising exports suggests that Chinese companies are becoming increasingly reliant on foreign demand. Again, this gives the EU more leverage in a trade war, because it means that Chinese companies can't easily redirect any affected exports back to Chinese consumers in their home market, given the weak domestic demand. Anyway, the third reason to be optimistic about Europe's prospects in any upcoming trade war is that Europe already knows how China is going to retaliate. Beijing is probably going to restrict rare earth exports, as it did to great effect during its trade war with the US last year. For context, rare earths are a set of 17 metallic elements that are used in a whole load of high-end technologies. As you might already know, China absolutely dominates the entire supply chain, accounting for about 60% of all rare earth mining globally, and more importantly, over 90% of all processing. When the Trump administration started the trade war last year, Beijing responded by both imposing reciprocal tariffs, but also by restricting the export of rare earths. This sparked panic in America's business community, who warned Trump and co. that their supply chains would freeze up unless Trump could negotiate some sort of truce. This obviously worked well back then, but it means that this time the EU knows what's coming, and thus should be able to take precautionary measures. Most obviously, European countries could stockpile rare earths, as Japan has done since 2010 when China first weaponized its rare earth dominance and halted exports following a maritime sovereignty dispute between the two countries. It's also worth noting that since the US-China trade war, other countries across the world have taken steps to reduce their singular dependence on Chinese rare earth exports, which means that the market is becoming more diversified all the time. Anyway, the fourth and final reason on our list is that Europe has its own choke points that it can weaponize in response. Most obviously, China still depends on lithographic machines from Dutch company ASML for advanced semiconductor manufacturing, a sector where the Dutch company holds something like 90% of market share. The EU could further restrict ASML exports to China, although this would probably invite retaliatory export controls on other semiconductor inputs, which is how China reacted last time the West restricted its trade with ASML. Alternatively, Europe could also restrict exports of certain machine goods, including high-end CNC machines, bearings, and engines, sectors that are still dominated by European companies. Finally, the EU's Aviation Safety Agency, which is in the process of assessing China's COMAC C919 aircraft, could withhold certification, which would severely constrain the C919's market access. All in all, while a trade war would be far from painless, the EU would do well to remember that it does hold some cards, and might thus be able to squeeze at least a concession or two out of Beijing. The latest issue of our magazine is out now, and if you want our best value ever, subscribing and using code SUMMER26 gets you your first copy for as cheap as £4.99, as well as 20% off as long as you stay subscribed. I told you about one of the articles at the start of this video, but this issue is truly jam-packed with content from all around the world. Obviously, the headline section is our rundown of Trump's wars around the world, discussing all of the different countries and regions that have faced Trump's military wrath, going nation by nation through our timeline, and reaching the ultimate question: has Trump created the modern holy war? From there, we dive into our regional sections, starting with the UK, where we unpack the results of the recent elections, take a look at the UK's odd foreign posture, and discuss if Britain has become ungovernable. Then in our EU section, we discuss how Russia's sphere of influence is fading, why Europe's energy transition isn't what you'd expect, as well as looking at the Euro's missing members. Finally, in the global section, we discuss whether we're seeing echoes of the First World War, what's next for Iran, as well as what really came from the Gen Z protests we saw emerging last year. That's not even everything. With this 80-page issue, our joint longest ever, there's even more to read than I've been able to mention here. So click the link in the description to learn more and grab your copy today.